Yo, what is going on, guys? Matthew V. Haynes here, aka the Clock Master. This is take number 10 of this intro. The video you guys are about to watch is my review of Outlander Season 4, Episode 2. If you guys want to see my full reaction, because I can't post reactions on YouTube anymore, if you want to see my full reaction to the episode unedited, you can check out my Patreon link in the description box below. We'll take you straight to Patreon exclusively. You guys can watch it over there. Here's a sneak peek of my reaction.
It is my intention that Jamie should act as master of the estate immediately.
Here comes problems.
I leave Riverrun in his hands.
Here comes problems. Oh boy. Every time Jamie gets inheritance of some sort, there's always a problem. I'm telling you, this lieutenant is going to cause problems. I'm telling you, bro. Nobody wants to hear me. All right, guys. So as I said, if you want to see more of that reaction, please make sure to check out my Patreon link down below. Enjoy the review. Welcome to the review section of this video. If you guys are on YouTube, if you want to see my reaction, I just finished watching this episode. If you want to see my reaction, like I said in the intro of the video, you can click the link in the description box below. It'll take you to my Patreon, and you can do that and watch it on Patreon. It should be up there right now. But welcome to the review section. I said this slightly, like, right after the reaction, like, literally right before I just did this part, this was a tough watch. This was a tough episode for me. If you saw the reaction, then you understand what I'm talking about. This is a tough watch for me, man. I want to save most of the slavery stuff for the end, so because that's what kind of made it tough. Yeah, that's what kind of made it. I'm just jotting something down in my notes really quickly if I got to write. Yeah, so I took some notes down, wrote everything down, which we're going to talk about. So the title of this episode is called "Do No Harm," and here in this episode we saw Jamie. This takes place like right after they just got robbed from the last episode. They just got robbed from Stephen Bonnet, which I hope they run into him again at some point and they get their revenge. I really need to see that. But they meet up with their aunt. You meet up with Jamie's aunt, Aunt Jocasta, and we find out that she has this beautiful estate by River Run, and she has this, you know, she's well known in the community, she's loved, and then we find out that she's blind. So that was a very different touch to everything else like that. But we find out that she's blind, but we also find out that she's a very nice person. She's very nice, and she seems to be caring, and which will bring more to the slavery part of it later. But you can tell that she has the, you know, the sympathy and, you know, empathy for a lot of the slaves, but is not much she can do about that. She can't really do anything about it. She really has no choice in the matter. So she's empathetic, and she tries to treat them, excuse me, as she said in the episode, with benevolence as much as she can. And then, you know, and that's the best she could do. She can't really do anything else other than that because of the law. And we see Jamie and Claire now getting used. Well, Claire is already aware of everything that has happened. She kind of already, because, you know, obviously she's from the 21st century, so she knows about what's going on. Or is it what, 20th century or 21st? Keep forgetting. 21st. So she keeps forgetting that she's not in the future anymore. She's in the past, and the 1700s is the 1700s of any place in the world, really, minus the exception of a few places. It's not really my favorite era in history, to be honest with you. You know, 1700s, mid to late 1700s in Great Britain, the British Empire, the United States. Well, before it was the United States and after it was the United States. All those areas were just horrible times, especially for black people or any non-white person, essentially. We even saw with Ethan Cho in Mr. Willoughby in season 3, him being Chinese, it wasn't as bad. He wasn't as badly treated as black people, but he was treated bad. No one really respected him because he was Chinese, but he wasn't treated as bad as black people. So he was still mistreated, being called Chinaman, and had all these stereotypes towards him. So pretty much anybody who wasn't white or European had an issue. Of course, there was an issue too between, and we saw. I'm kind of veering off of my notes here a little bit, but it's fine. We saw a similarity of this type of treatment in Scotland within the first 3 seasons, the first two seasons, 3 seasons of this show. Any Highlander, any Scottish person in the Highlands was mistreated because they were called savages. They were called, even though they were Caucasian, even though they are Caucasian, they were called savages, treated as wild, people and they were treated with no respect by the British Empire. And the British Empire just did not respect these people. Anybody who was a subject under the law was mistreated. There were some Scots and some Irish people that I know throughout history, because I'm a big history buff, which is one of the reasons why I love Outlander, is for it does a great job with mixing historical accuracy with fiction. So it has a way of mixing a lot of fictional things and some pretty unbelievable stuff with some things that are very accurate through history. And if you can fact check it, you can go and read some things, especially with the Jacobite Rising and Battle of Culloden and a lot of those other major events that happen throughout Outlander. Those are things you can fact check and kind of put 2 and 2 together and say, okay, Bonnie Prince Charlie did exist, or this person did exist, or this situation did exist. So it's one of the reasons I like about Outlander. One of the things I like about it. But we saw the Highlanders weren't treated properly. A lot of them weren't treated with respect, and they were just treated like scum. Anybody who was a British subject was treated as scum. But Africans got it worse, in my opinion. There were, like I said, there were some Scottish and Irish slaves throughout that time period a lot too, especially in the Caribbean too. There have been a lot of Irish slaves and Scottish slaves. But Africans got it worse. So we saw the similarities. Even Ian brought it up. He said, "Oh, the Native Americans or the Indians," as he said. Even though the correct term is American. They are American, Native American. They, a matter of fact, I don't even like to call them Native American, because America was a name that was given by Europeans. So I just like to call them natives. I just call them natives, to be honest. But they were young Ian was showing the similarities between being a Native American and being a Highlander, and that they both were very similar. And as far as it's their land, they were there first. It's their place. They should be entitled to it. And you see the lieutenant or lieutenant, you want to say, I'm laughing at him like, I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything. So it's more believable, historically saying, it's more realistic for a Highlander to be more sympathetic to a slave than a British or a colonial subject. It's more believable because Highlanders can sort of, especially at the time, I'm just going through history and what I've read, so I don't know exactly if you know what I'm saying, but as far as that is concerned, but history tells me this. Most Highlanders, if they were put in a situation like that to encounter a slave, would be more, or a slave or a Native American or whatever, would be more sympathetic to them or empathetic with them compared to someone who's part of the British Empire at the time. Granted, there are racist Scots, and they are racist racist people everywhere. So not everyone's excluded from that. I'm not generalizing everyone, but there's good and bad to everyone, as we saw. So it was cool seeing some of those things being implemented. What else did I wrote down? Yeah, what I forgot to say too. The intro for the show always likes to showcase things that's going to happen within the first half of the season. Of things like that. So we saw the hands being covered, so we knew that somebody was dying. Some black guy was gonna die. We saw the estate in the intro. That's also gonna die. We also saw what is Fraser's Ridge, also in there as well. So we're gonna see Fraser's Ridge at some point, and what's gonna happen with that. So I just like how the intro always kind of foreshadows what we're gonna see and what's gonna happen. It always does that. It's such a cool thing how they always implement all of that. Now, getting to the whole slaves thing, I kind of touched a little bit on the 1700 slaves and dealing with slaves. This episode really dealt with talking about, and I got upset in season 3 when they were addressing the whole slave situation in Jamaica, and they just kind of glanced over it and didn't really do much with it. I'm like, oh, they're just gonna show it, not really do much with it. They're not even gonna acknowledge it. Okay, whatever. But in this episode was more or less dedicated to dealing with the reality that in this time period there were many hundreds, thousands of Africans that were, you know, put into slavery and that were being mistreated. So this kind of gave us a POV from Claire and Jamie's perspective as to what's going on in the colonies in the United States, because they weren't really seeing too much of this going on in Scotland. They weren't seeing too much of this going on. They only started seeing a lot of it, especially Claire only started seeing it firsthand. She's dealt with discrimination and saw discrimination in her time period, but she only started seeing this whole slavery thing when she got to Jamaica and when she got to those islands in the Caribbean back in season 3. So to her, she's still trying to process, like, just getting used to the fact that this time period, these people had to deal with this. And she's not getting, I don't think she'll ever really get used to that fact. I mean, Claire is this character that she comes from a time period that doesn't accept, you know, she comes from that doesn't accept a lot of things, you know, because if you saw in season 1, she was being mistreated because she's a woman, and because this, or because she practiced medicine, or she said this, or she spoke a certain way, and you know, and they dealt with a lot of woman abuse and a lot of things that women have to deal with in season 1, season 2, and they just and they dealt with certain topics over time. So we're seeing in this episode they strictly, and I do commend the creators and the writers of Outlander for addressing this situation and actually acknowledging it. They brought it up and they showed different perspectives. There's people who are like, okay, this is the law, I don't care, they're Negroes, blah blah blah, they're racist people. And then there's people like Jamie's aunt, who's like, I'm not racist to these people, but there's not much I can do. So she recognizes that there's not much that she can do in this situation, even though she would rather have it a different way. There's not much she can do. And then there's people like Jamie and Claire, who's like, nah, I can't accept this. This ain't right. I can't accept this. And then Jamie's now being taught and instructed that, look, even if you were to stop something, there's still the law in the United States that's going to either get you killed, it's going to get all of these people killed, all of these slaves harmed, and then get you killed, and possibly you and your wife killed and or imprisoned. So there's all of those situations that is being faced, and it's a bit of a complexity. And towards the end, I like watching the behind the episode thing where they kind of explain a little bit. They're saying like it's a lose-lose situation. There's not much they can do. Claire likes to save lives, but she couldn't do much at that situation. There's not much she could have done with that. So I like how they dealt with this very controversial situation, this historical thing that plagues the United States history and plagues the British history and the British Empire history is slavery. European and colonization, slavery plagues history of most of Europe, Northern Europe and Northern Eastern Europe, to be more specific. So it plagues a lot of that. And they dealt with this in this episode, and I'm very grateful that they dealt with it and showed how Claire would react to it, because, you know, and being realistic with these situations and how caring of a person that she is, because Claire would never want anybody, doesn't even matter. She would even see a murderer, like a straight up murderer, someone who tried to attack her back in season 3, who tried to attack her, and she still saved him, because that it's not in her DNA, it's not in her DNA, in her brain to just let someone die. She's going to save them, even if they're criminal, and she would rather them do time in prison than for them to die. So unless, you know, Claire has killed a few times, so that's what she does. She did that, but she likes to save people. So the whole riots and mob situation, like, it's so unbelievable that these people, just because they're upset about something, they're gonna grab a gun and walk up on somebody's house, start knocking on the door. There's a lot of racist white people in the United States right now that do things like that because they believe, you know, they have the right to do this and the right to say that, and they have the right to just walk up on your door and demand this to be done at this time, at this, and it all started here. It all started here. You know, some people may not agree with me on that, but I'm just calling out the truth for what it is. You know, I lived in Virginia when I first came to this country as a kid. I lived in Virginia, And I used to see a lot of this kind of stuff going on. You know, I'm hearing it on the news. Seeing how these people, not to this extent, but I've seen people try to take authority into their own hands just because they believe they're entitled to something and they want to do something and this and the other. And you see it all the time, and it's so annoying. And it all started here. And what's crazy is that, like, you know, I was you know, as for many of you guys don't know, I was born in Grenada. I was born in Grenada. It's a West Indian country, if you guys don't know. And my parents are South America. And for me, there's a lot about slave history that wasn't as, you know, persistent or really known, you know, in my country where I was born, because my country was part of the British Empire before it was released. And slavery ended in the British Empire way before it ended in the United States. And when it did end, there were a lot of the British Empire practically just left Grenada and a lot of those other islands alone. Like, okay, they're gone. So a lot of us, you know, a lot of people in Grenada and a lot of those other islands had to just, you know, they were able to develop things for themselves and, you know, reincorporate things for themselves. So a lot of slave history, we don't really have so much, you know, I never really grew up with a lot of racism and things like that and stuff like that in my country, because we never, for us, we just like everybody. And I only started experiencing racism when I came to the United States as a boy. And I started seeing, and I started learning how much more of an impact the slave trade had on the United States and African Americans than it did on Afro-Grenadians or Afro-Guyanese people or Afro-Trinidadian people or Afro-Caribbean people in general. The impact of slavery had so much more of an effect on African Americans than it did on Afro-Caribbeans. And it's something that, you know, granted, there are a lot of Afro-Caribbeans that acknowledge this and acknowledge the history, and we you know, we stand up for, you know, black rights, and we stand up for historical recognition. And it's only when I started analyzing African American history and started learning more about a lot of things that happened in this country is how I started to understand why a lot of African Americans feel the way they do about certain things, especially if, like, their great grandfather was a slave, you know, or something like that. Those types of situations. It's so crazy how much of an impact it left on a lot, and a lot of people to this day are still scarred by the impact of the American slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade and colonization. And it's just such a deep thing that people can't necessarily get over. And it's so, and I hate when people say, oh, just get over it, it happened, you know, a long time ago. It's not something that's easily, because even up to the 1960s, there's been a lot of racial tension in this country, and people being lynched and hung and on all sorts of stuff. So it's not that easy. Even though slavery ended in the United States in a formal fashion, I won't get too much into that, but it ended in a formal fashion. Slavery formally ended. There were still years, a wide gap of just pain and just racism and prejudice, and a lot of that is more stronger in America than it is in the Caribbean. During the 1960s in the Caribbean, what was going on to African Americans wasn't happening to Afro-Caribbean people, at least in Grenada and a lot of other countries. So the difference is so much, and you don't really understand until you actually really put yourself in someone else's shoes and try to learn and understand what's going on. And watching something like this definitely gives me more of a perspective as to how people who grew up, who were born and raised in this country, who had generations of history of people that were in slavery. You know what I'm saying? I believe, like, maybe my great-great-great-grandfather on my father's side was a slave, I believe. Because a lot of them in Guyana were brought from, like, Sierra Leone. So that, I believe, is how far back it goes for me. That's what I'm thinking. My math could be off or whatever. It could be sooner. It could be thing. But it's like, for me, it's like my family is in the Caribbean. There's no person in the Caribbean that's not, like, racially mixed in some type of way or culturally mixed. That's what I love about the Caribbean. Everybody is pretty much mixed up with a lot of cultures. You know, my dad's side of the family, there's Portuguese and there's African. My mom's side of the family, there's East Indian, Chinese, and there's also African. So there's this big melting pot of culture within my family and within the Caribbean itself, which is why I can't necessarily like be mad at anyone, because I am literally a spawn of multicultural, and I appreciate the world and I appreciate people. So, you know, and I'm kind of veering off into what I discussed, but this episode really did raise up some super large social commentary and some you know, topics that need to be discussed and that people won't talk about. So you know, back to the show and back to everything, to just to wrap up this review. I'm very glad that this episode discussed this topic and showcased what the reality of what would have happened back in those days to someone who, you know, went against the law, or an African slave, or how people would react. And I do appreciate this show for doing that. Just thumbs up. For me, it was very kind of emotional just to watch what that poor boy had to go through. Imagine just being in your own country, like being back in Africa and like just enjoying like life as you know it, and you have your religion stripped away from you. You have some people, your manhood stripped away from you, your family stripped away from you, everything just stripped away from you, and you're treated as property. And you know, it's very saddening. And we got to like I said, we got an introduction to how Claire feels about this back in Jamaica, back in the Outlander season 3. So anyway, so that's it for my review. I hope you guys enjoyed my review. I kind of veered off more than I kind of wanted to veer off into, but I hope you enjoyed my review nonetheless. If you watched my reaction on Patreon, thank you for your pledges. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next episode. I'm probably going to do a reaction to that very soon. Probably right after this one. I have to take a little break, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to join Patreon if you want to see the reaction, and I'll see you guys later. Clockmaster out.